When my husband passed away, his children made it crystal clear I didn't belong in their family circle. They excluded me from gatherings, removed me from photos, and treated me like an outsider who had somehow infiltrated their perfect world. But when they discovered I owned the one thing that could solve all their problems, suddenly I wasn't just family. I was the most important person in their lives. This is the story of how I learned that sometimes the people who underestimate you the most are the ones who end up needing you the most, and how I discovered a strength I never knew I possessed. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Linda Martinez, and at 62 years old, I thought I had learned everything there was to know about family dynamics. I was wrong, dead wrong. The morning everything changed started like any other Tuesday in Riverside, California. I was tending to my rose garden at Maplewood Manor, the Victorian estate I'd called home for over 30 years, when my phone rang with news that would turn my carefully constructed world upside down. The caller was Dr. Stevens from Riverside Memorial Hospital, his voice heavy with the kind of gravity that makes your stomach drop before your mind can process the words. Bob had collapsed during his morning jog. By the time the paramedics arrived, my husband of 4 years was gone. Just like that. No warning, no goodbye, no chance to say the 1,000 things that suddenly seemed desperately important. I remember, standing in my kitchen afterward, still in my gardening clothes, dirt under my fingernails, staring at the coffee mug Bob had left on the counter that morning. It still had his lip print on the rim. The normalcy of it felt obscene somehow. How could the world look exactly the same when everything had fundamentally shifted? The silence in the house was different now, heavier, more permanent than the comfortable, quiet Bob and I had shared during our morning routines. Bob Thompson had been my second chance at love. I'd lost my first husband, Carlos, to cancer 8 years earlier, and I'd honestly believed that chapter of my life was closed. At 58, I wasn't looking for romance when Bob literally bumped into me at the grocery store, sending my carefully arranged produce selection rolling across the floor. He was embarrassed, I was flustered, and somehow in the chaos of collecting scattered apples and oranges, we started talking. Really talking, in a way I hadn't with anyone since Carlos died. Bob was recently divorced, his marriage of 25, years having ended when his ex-wife decided she wanted to find herself in Costa Rica with her yoga instructor. He was raw from the experience, uncertain about dating, and refreshingly honest about his fears of starting over. We bonded over shared experiences of loss, the challenges of rebuilding life after 50, and a mutual love of old movies and terrible puns. Our courtship was gentle, unhurried, built on friendship and genuine affection rather than desperate passion. When we married 4 years ago in a small ceremony in my backyard, surrounded by roses and the handful of friends who had supported us both through our respective difficult periods, I thought I was finally settled. Bob moved into Maplewood Manor with me, and for the first time since Carlos died, the house felt truly alive again. Bob loved the history of the place, spent hours listening to me tell stories about the renovations Carlos and I had undertaken, the family gatherings we'd hosted, the memories embedded in every room. But there was always an underlying tension I tried to ignore. Bob's 3 children had never quite accepted our marriage. Michael, at 35, was the eldest and most vocal in his disapproval. He'd inherited his father's stubborn streak, but none of his warmth, working as a real estate developer with an eye always on the bottom line. Sarah, 32 and recently divorced herself, seemed to view my relationship with their father as some kind of betrayal of their mother's memory, despite the fact that their parents had been divorced for 2 years before Bob and I even met. Jennifer, the youngest at 28, was perhaps the most painful because she was polite to my face while making it clear through 1,000 small gestures that I would never be family to her. The funeral arrangements became my first real taste of what life would be like without Bob as a buffer between his children and me. I'd naturally assumed I would plan the service, make the decisions about the ceremony and burial. After all, I was his wife, his next of kin, the person who knew his current wishes and preferences. But within hours of his death, Michael had taken charge with the efficiency of a military operation, informing me rather than consulting me about every detail. "We've arranged for Dad to be buried next to Mom," Michael announced during what he called a family meeting in my own living room. It's what he would have wanted. I sat in my own chair, in my own house, feeling like an intruder as Bob's 3 children discussed their father's final arrangements as if I wasn't there. The burial plot next to their mother had been purchased decades ago, back when Bob still believed his first marriage would last forever. He'd never mentioned it to me, and frankly, I'd never thought to ask. Why would I? Bob and I had talked about our own final wishes in the vague way that couples do, assuming we had years to figure out the details. "I think your father might have had different preferences now," I said carefully, trying to maintain the diplomatic tone I'd perfected over 4 years of navigating these family dynamics. "Perhaps we should discuss options that reflect his current life." Sarah looked at me with barely concealed disdain. His current life was just the last 4 years. He had 25 years with our mother and 35 years with us. I think we know what he would want. The sting of that comment lingered long after they left. Just the last 4 years. As if the life Bob and I had built together, the love we'd shared, the daily intimacies of marriage were somehow less significant than his previous relationships. As if I had been a temporary diversion rather than his chosen partner for the remainder of his life. The funeral itself was even more painful. I found myself relegated to what felt like a supporting role in my own husband's memorial service. The children had chosen the flowers, selected the music, written the obituary, and arranged for the reception without consulting me on any detail. When people approached me with condolences, Michael or Sarah would often step in to redirect the conversation, as if I were too fragile or unimportant to handle discussions about Bob's life and legacy. The most humiliating moment came during the photo session after the service. The funeral director was arranging family photos for the memorial album, and naturally, I moved to stand with Bob's children for what I assumed would be the primary family portrait. Michael put his hand on my arm, not unkindly, but firmly. "This one's just for the immediate family," he said, the words hitting me like a physical blow. "You understand." I stepped back, watching as the 3 siblings arranged themselves around their father's casket, their faces appropriately solemn for posterity. Several of Bob's friends and colleagues witnessed the exchange, their uncomfortable expressions making it clear they recognized the slight for what it was. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. I spent the remainder of the reception feeling like a guest at my own husband's funeral, making polite conversation while fighting back tears of grief that were now complicated by humiliation and anger. The week following the funeral brought a parade of well-meaning visitors to Maplewood Manor. Bob's friends and colleagues stopped by to offer condolences, share memories, and provide the kind of support that helps newly widowed people navigate those first impossible days. But I noticed that many of these visits felt somewhat awkward, as if people weren't quite sure how to interact with me now that Bob was gone. Several mentioned having seen or spoken with his children, and there was an underlying current in these conversations that made me realize Michael, Sarah, and Jennifer had been having their own separate receiving of condolences, their own parallel grieving process that didn't include me. My sister Emma drove down from Los Angeles that weekend, taking one look at my state and immediately declaring she was staying for a week whether I wanted her to or not. Emma had always been the more direct of the two of us, 8 years of teaching, high school having given her a low tolerance for nonsense and an ability to cut straight to the heart of any situation. "They're treating you like hired help," she said bluntly over coffee in my kitchen, her voice carrying the indignation I hadn't allowed myself to feel. You were married to their father for 4 years. You took care of him when he had pneumonia last winter. You coordinated his medication schedule, drove him to doctor appointments, made sure he ate properly when his blood pressure was acting up. You were his wife in every sense of the word, and they're acting like you were some kind of temporary arrangement. Emma's words gave voice to feelings I'd been trying to suppress. The truth was, I had been more than Bob's wife in those final years. I'd been his primary caregiver during several health scares, his companion through the challenges of aging, his partner in all the daily decisions that make up a shared life. When Bob's blood pressure medication made him dizzy, I'd reorganized our bedroom to minimize fall risks. When his arthritis flared up, I'd modified our garden tools and furniture to accommodate his limitations. I'd been the one who noticed his increasing fatigue months before his fatal heart attack, who had scheduled the cardiologist appointment he never lived to keep. But pointing out these contributions felt petty somehow, like I was keeping score. In a relationship that should have been about love rather than obligation, I'd cared for Bob not because I expected recognition or reward, but because that's what spouses do for each other. The fact that his children seemed to view my role as insignificant was painful, but I told myself it was born from their own grief, rather than genuine malice. The first real indication that something more calculated was happening came 2 weeks after the funeral, when David Chen, the family attorney, called to schedule a meeting about Bob's will. I'd met David several times over the years, usually at social functions, and he'd always been pleasant and professional. But there was something different in his tone during this call, a careful formality that made me pay attention. "I'll need to meet with you and Bob's children together," he explained. "There are some complexities in the estate that require discussion with all interested parties." Interested parties. The phrase struck me as odd. I was Bob's widow, his next of kin according to law. Why would I be grouped together with his children as merely one of several interested parties, rather than the primary beneficiary? Bob and I had never had detailed discussions about inheritance and estate planning, operating under the comfortable assumption that we had years to sort out those details. We'd both made basic wills after our marriage, but I'd assumed these were largely formalities given our respective family situations. The meeting was scheduled for the following Thursday at David's office downtown. I arrived a few minutes early, wanting to compose myself before facing Bob's children, in what I suspected might be another uncomfortable family dynamic. The law office was traditionally decorated, all dark wood and leather furniture, with an atmosphere of gravitas that seemed appropriate for settling the affairs of the dead. Michael, Sarah, and Jennifer were already seated when I arrived, arranged in chairs that faced David's desk like students in a classroom. There was an empty chair obviously intended for me, positioned slightly apart from theirs in a way that seemed to emphasize my separate status. David greeted me professionally but warmly, his demeanor suggesting he was aware of the family tensions and trying to navigate them diplomatically. "Thank you all for coming," David began, opening a file that I assumed contained Bob's will and related documents. "I know this is a difficult time, but it's important that we address Bob's estate planning sooner rather than later. There are some time-sensitive issues that require decisions from the family." He paused, looking around the room with the kind of careful expression attorneys develop when they're about to deliver unwelcome news. I should start by explaining that Bob's estate is more complicated than it might initially appear. While he had significant assets, he also had substantial debts that will need to be addressed before any distribution can occur. This was news to me. Bob and I had maintained largely separate finances during our marriage, an arrangement that had seemed practical given our relatively late-in-life union and our respective independent financial histories. I knew he had retirement accounts and investments, and I'd assumed his financial situation was stable, if not particularly robust. The mention of substantial debts was the first indication that I might not have had the complete picture of my husband's financial life. Michael leaned forward in his chair, his business instincts clearly engaged. "What kind of debts are we talking about?" David consulted his notes before responding. business loans related to some property investments that didn't perform as expected, some significant credit card debt, and a second mortgage on his previous residence that was taken out during the divorce proceedings. The total comes to approximately $450,000. The number hit the room like a physical force. I felt my breath catch, suddenly understanding why David had seemed so careful in his preliminary remarks. $450,000 in debt would likely consume most, if not all, of Bob's assets, leaving little, if anything, for inheritance. Sarah was the first to speak, her voice tight with anxiety. But what about his retirement accounts? His investments? He always said he was financially secure. He was for his personal needs, David replied diplomatically. But financial security for day-to-day living is different from having significant liquid assets available for inheritance. Most of his retirement income was structured as annuities that died with him. His investment portfolio has been impacted by market fluctuations over the past few years. After settling the debts and paying estate taxes and legal fees, the remaining assets will be quite modest. Jennifer, who had been silent until now, spoke up with barely controlled emotion. So there's nothing? Dad always talked about leaving us something, about making sure we were taken care of. The pain in her voice was genuine, and I felt a stab of sympathy despite the weeks of being treated as an outsider. These were Bob's children, and regardless of how they'd behaved toward me, they were facing the loss of their father and now the additional blow of financial disappointment. Bob had indeed spoken often about wanting to leave something meaningful to his children, and I could imagine how devastating this news must be for them. David's next words, however, shifted the entire dynamic of the meeting in a way I could never have anticipated. There is one significant asset that could change this situation substantially, he said, his attention turning toward me for the first time since he'd begun his presentation. Linda, I believe you own property that might be relevant to this discussion. I felt every eye in the room focus on me with sudden intensity. My house? I asked, confused about why Maplewood Manor would be relevant to Bob's estate planning. But that's been in my family for decades. It has nothing to do with Bob's assets. Not directly, David agreed. But I've been researching comparable properties in your area, and given the current real estate market, particularly for historic properties with significant acreage, your estate appears to be worth considerably more than you might realize. Current market value estimates suggest Maplewood Manor could be worth between $2.5 and $3 million. The silence that followed was profound. I stared at David, trying to process not just the number he'd mentioned, but the implications of why he'd researched my property in the first place. $3 million was far more than I'd ever imagined. I'd inherited Maplewood Manor outright when Carlos died, but that had been during a much different real estate market. I'd never had it professionally appraised for market value because I'd never had any intention of selling. It was my home, my sanctuary, the place where I'd built 2 marriages and planned to live out my remaining years. Michael was the first to break the silence, his voice carefully controlled in the way that indicated intense calculation happening behind his words. That would certainly change the family's financial situation, he said, looking directly at me for the first time since I'd entered the room. It would change my financial situation, I corrected, feeling a flutter of unease at his phrasing. Maplewood Manor is my property, inherited from my first husband. It has nothing to do with Bob's estate or his debts. Of course not legally, Sarah said quickly, but there was something in her tone that made me pay attention. But morally, as a family, if there were a way to help resolve Dad's debts and ensure that his estate could provide something meaningful to his children. She let the sentence hang unfinished, but the implication was clear. They were suggesting, however indirectly, that I should consider using my property to solve their father's financial problems and provide them with the inheritance they'd expected. The meeting ended awkwardly, with David promising to provide everyone with detailed financial statements and legal options for addressing the estate's debts. But as we prepared to leave, I noticed the way Bob's children exchanged glances. the subtle nods and raised eyebrows that indicated they would be having their own conversation about what they'd learned. Walking to my car in the parking lot, I felt like everything had shifted beneath my feet. In the span of an hour, I'd learned that my husband had hidden significant financial problems, that my own home was worth far more than I'd realized, and that Bob's children viewed me as a potential solution to their inheritance disappointment, rather than a fellow grieving family member. The drive home to Maplewood Manor gave me time to think, and by the time I pulled into my circular driveway, I was beginning to understand that this meeting had marked the beginning of something I was entirely unprepared for. The children who had excluded me from family photos, who had treated me like an unwelcome intruder in their father's life, were now looking at me with very different eyes. As I walked through the front door of my home, I caught my reflection in the antique mirror in the entryway. I looked exactly the same as I had that morning, but somehow I felt fundamentally different. The woman staring back at me was no longer just Linda Martinez, grieving widow trying to find her place in a complicated family dynamic. I was now Linda Martinez, owner of a $3 million estate, holder of the solution to everyone else's problems, and I had the distinct feeling that my real challenges were just beginning. The phone calls started 3 days after the attorney meeting. The first was from Jennifer, and I almost didn't answer because I was in the middle of replanting the herb garden that Bob had helped me design last spring. Her voice was softer than I'd heard it in months, with an unfamiliar warmth that immediately put me on guard. "Linda, I hope I'm not bothering you," she began, using my first name instead of the awkward pause that usually preceded any direct address. "I was thinking about you and wondering how you're holding up. This must be such a difficult time." I set down my gardening trowel and walked toward the house, something in her tone making me want to be fully focused on this conversation. In 4 years of knowing Jennifer, she had never called me just to check on my well-being. Our interactions had been limited to polite exchanges at family gatherings, conversations that felt scripted and careful, designed to avoid any real connection or conflict. "I'm managing," I replied cautiously. "Each day is a little different. Thank you for asking." "I was also thinking about what we learned at David's office," she continued, and there it was, the real reason for the call. "It must be overwhelming to discover that your property is worth so much. I can't imagine how strange that must feel." I settled into Bob's favorite chair on the back porch, looking out at the rose garden where he used to read his morning paper. "It was surprising," I admitted. "I've lived here so long that I never really thought about market value. This has always just been home." "Of course, and it's a beautiful home," Jennifer said, her voice taking on an almost wistful quality. "Dad used to talk about how much he loved living there with you. He said it felt like stepping into history every day." This was news to me. Bob had certainly seemed comfortable at Maplewood Manor, but he'd rarely spoken about the house in such poetic terms. I wondered if Jennifer was sharing a genuine memory, or crafting one for effect. With Bob gone, there was no way to verify which conversations had actually taken place, and which were being reimagined to serve current purposes. He did seem to enjoy the space, I agreed neutrally. "Linda, I hope you don't mind me saying this, but I think we may have gotten off on the wrong foot over the years." Jennifer's voice carried what sounded like genuine regret. "I know Dad's divorce from Mom was hard on all of us, and maybe we weren't as welcoming as we should have been when you and Dad got together. You made him happy, and that should have mattered more to us than our own complicated feelings." I was so surprised by this apparent apology that I didn't respond immediately. Jennifer filled the silence with what seemed like nervous energy. "The thing is, we're all dealing with Dad's death and now these financial revelations, and I think maybe we should be supporting each other instead of maintaining old distances. We're family now, whether we planned it that way or not." Family. The word she'd been unable to apply to me for 4 years was now being offered like a gift, and I found myself both touched and suspicious. People don't typically undergo personality transformations in the space of 3 days without significant motivation. I appreciate that, Jennifer, I said carefully. It would be nice if we could find a way to move forward together. I'm so glad you feel that way, she said, enthusiasm creeping into her voice. Actually, that's part of why I'm calling. Sarah and Michael and I were talking, and we thought maybe we could all have dinner together this weekend. Nothing formal, just a chance to spend time together and maybe talk about how we can honor Dad's memory while also dealing with the practical issues we're all facing. The practical issues, code for Bob's debts and their disappeared inheritance. I understood now that this dinner invitation was likely the opening move in whatever strategy Bob's children had developed since learning about my property's value. But I was curious enough about their approach to agree to the meeting. That sounds nice, I said. Would you like to come here? I could make something simple. Actually, we were thinking maybe we could treat you, Jennifer replied quickly. There's a lovely place at Golden Valley Country Club that Dad always enjoyed. Our treat, of course. Saturday evening around 7, Golden Valley Country Club, where Bob's children were members, and I decidedly was not. Where they would be comfortable and I would be the outsider, despite being the one supposedly being honored as a guest. I recognized the tactical advantage they were claiming, but I also recognized that refusing would make me seem difficult or ungracious. That works for me, I agreed. I'll look forward to it. After ending the call, I sat on the porch for a long time, trying to understand what had just happened. Jennifer's approach had been skillful, combining apparent emotional vulnerability with a clear agenda. The apology had felt genuine enough, but the timing was obviously strategic. The invitation to dinner was positioned as a family reconciliation, but the choice of venue and the emphasis on practical issues suggested something more calculated. I realized I needed perspective from someone who knew me well enough to see through any manipulation I might be missing. I called my neighbor, Pat Morrison, who had lived next door to Maplewood Manor for 15 years and had witnessed the entire arc of my relationship with Bob and his children. They want to have dinner with you? Pat's voice carried immediate skepticism. Linda, honey, these are the same people who didn't want you in the family photo 3 weeks ago. Now suddenly you're family, and they want to take you to their fancy country club. People can change, I said, though I didn't entirely believe it myself. Maybe Bob's death has given them perspective on what's really important. Or maybe they've done the math on $3 million, Pat replied dryly. I'm not saying people can't grow and change, but the timing here is awfully convenient. Pat's bluntness was exactly what I needed to hear. She'd watched me navigate the complexities of Bob's family for 4 years, had witnessed the small slights and careful exclusions that had characterized my relationship with his children. She'd also seen how hard I'd tried to build bridges, how many olive branches I'd extended only to have them politely but firmly declined. What do you think they want? I asked. I think they want your house, Pat said without hesitation. Or, at least they want access to the money your house represents. Bob left them with debts instead of an inheritance, and you've got the solution to their problem sitting right there on 5 acres of prime California real estate. The directness of her assessment was both helpful and unsettling. I'd been thinking along similar lines, but hearing it stated so plainly made the situation feel more serious somehow. These weren't just awkward family dynamics anymore. This was about money, significant money, and people's behavior could become unpredictable when large sums were involved. So what should I do? I asked. Go to dinner, Pat advised. Be pleasant, be polite, and see what they're really after. But don't commit to anything, and don't let them make you feel guilty about protecting what's yours. That house isn't just your financial security, Linda. It's your home, your history, your connection to Carlos and the life you built together. Don't let anyone make you forget that. The rest of the week passed quietly, but I found myself paying attention to small details that I might have previously overlooked. There was a card from Sarah in my mailbox, a simple sympathy card with a handwritten note expressing condolences for my loss and appreciation for the care I'd given Bob during his final years. Michael called to ask if I needed any help with household maintenance, explaining that Bob had always handled certain repairs and he wanted to make sure I wasn't struggling with anything I couldn't manage alone. These gestures would have meant a great deal to me a month earlier, when I was feeling isolated and excluded from Bob's family. Now they felt calculated, each kindness carrying an undertone of strategy rather than genuine concern. I found myself analyzing every interaction, looking for hidden motives and secondary agendas. It was an exhausting way to live, but it felt necessary given what I now understood about the financial stakes involved. Saturday evening arrived with the kind of perfect California weather that made everything look like a postcard. I chose my outfit carefully, wanting to look appropriate for the country club setting while also feeling comfortable and confident. I settled on a navy dress that Carlos had always complimented, paired with the pearl earrings Bob had given me for our second anniversary. Looking in the mirror, I reminded myself that I was Linda Martinez, widow and homeowner, not a supplicant, hoping for acceptance from people who had never wanted to accept me. Golden Valley Country Club was exactly what I'd expected. Manicured lawns, expensive cars in the parking lot, and an atmosphere of understated exclusivity that made it clear this was a place for people who belonged to certain social and economic circles. The hostess greeted me with professional courtesy, but I noticed the subtle way she assessed my appearance and demeanor, clearly categorizing me as someone's guest rather than a member. Bob's children were already seated at a corner table with a view of the golf course, and I felt a familiar flutter of nervousness as I approached them. But something was different this time. Michael stood to pull out my chair, Sarah smiled warmly, and complimented my dress, and Jennifer immediately asked if I'd like to start with a cocktail. The contrast with every previous family gathering was so stark that I felt disoriented. "You look lovely, Linda," Sarah said, and her tone carried none of the perfunctory politeness that had characterized our previous interactions. "That color is beautiful on you." "Thank you," I replied, settling into my chair and accepting the menu Michael handed me. "This is a nice place. Bob mentioned it several times over the years." "Dad loved coming here," Michael said, his voice taking on the warm tone people use when sharing fond memories. He always said the golf course reminded him of courses he played when he was younger, before work and family responsibilities took up all his time. This was the most personal thing Michael had ever shared with me about his father, and under different circumstances, I would have been genuinely touched by the glimpse into Bob's inner life. But given the context, I found myself wondering whether this memory was real or whether it was being deployed to create a sense of intimacy and connection. The dinner progressed pleasantly, with conversation flowing more easily than it ever had. During family gatherings when Bob was alive, we talked about Bob's love of old movies, his terrible jokes, his pride in his children's accomplishments. Sarah shared stories about Bob teaching her to drive. Michael recalled fishing trips from his childhood, and Jennifer described how Bob had helped her through a difficult period in college when she'd been unsure about her major. I found myself genuinely enjoying these glimpses into the man I'd married, hearing about aspects of his personality and history that he'd never shared with me directly. Bob had been somewhat reticent about his past, particularly his years as a young father, and I'd respected his privacy rather than pushing for details. Now his children were offering me a more complete picture of who he'd been, and despite my skepticism about their motives, I was grateful for these insights. It wasn't until we were finishing our main courses that the conversation began to shift toward more serious topics. Sarah was the one who introduced the transition, her tone becoming more thoughtful and deliberate. "Linda, we've all been thinking a lot about Dad's estate situation since we met with David," she began. "It's been really difficult to accept that. Dad struggled financially without any of us knowing. I keep wondering if there were signs we missed, ways we could have helped him." "Your father was proud," I replied carefully. "He wouldn't have wanted to burden any of us with his financial worries, I didn't know about the extent of his debts either. That's what makes this whole situation so sad, Jennifer added. Dad always talked about leaving us something meaningful, something that would help us remember him and maybe provide some security for our own families. Finding out that there's nothing left, that his debts actually exceed his assets, it feels like losing him all over again. I could hear the genuine pain in her voice, and I felt a stab of sympathy despite my wariness about the direction of this conversation. These were Bob's children, dealing with the complicated grief that comes when financial stress compounds emotional loss. I understand that must be very difficult, I said gently. Your father loved you all very much. I know he would be devastated to know that his financial problems are causing you additional pain. Michael leaned forward slightly, his business instincts clearly engaged. The thing is, Linda, we've been talking about whether there might be ways to honor Dad's intentions even though his estate can't provide what he hoped to leave us. Here it comes, I thought. The real purpose of this dinner, dressed up in language, about honoring Bob's intentions and family unity. What do you mean? I asked, though I suspected I already knew. Well, Sarah said, choosing her words carefully, we know that Dad was incredibly happy living at Maplewood Manor with you. He used to say it was the most peaceful period of his adult life, living in such a beautiful, historic home with someone who truly understood him. He did seem content there, I agreed neutrally. And we know how much that house means to you, Jennifer added quickly. It's your family home, your connection to your first husband, your security and independence. We would never suggest that you should give that up. I waited, knowing there was a but coming. But, Michael continued, given that the house has appreciated so significantly in value, and given that Dad's estate situation is so challenging, we wondered if there might be some arrangement that could help everyone. What kind of arrangement? Yusai asked, though I was beginning to understand exactly what they had in mind. Sarah pulled out a folder that had been sitting beside her chair, clearly prepared for this moment. We've been researching options, and there are several ways that property assets can be used to provide financial benefit without requiring someone to actually sell or move. She opened the folder and spread several documents on the table between us. For example, you could take out a substantial home equity loan against the property. Given its current value, you could easily borrow enough to settle Dad's debts and provide something for his children, while still maintaining full ownership and residence. Michael nodded enthusiastically. The loan payments would be very manageable, given the property's value, and you'd benefit from any future appreciation. Everyone wins. I stared at the documents they'd prepared, recognizing the care and research that had gone into developing this proposal. These weren't desperate people grasping at straws. These were 3 adults who had identified a problem, developed a solution, and were now implementing a carefully planned approach to get what they wanted. Another option, Jennifer added, would be to sell a portion of the property. You have 5 acres, which is much more than you need for personal use. A developer could purchase 2 or 3 acres for residential development, while leaving you with the house and enough land for privacy and gardening. I looked around the table at the 3 faces watching me expectantly, and I realized that everything about this evening had been orchestrated toward this moment. The warmth, the shared memories, the apparent family reconciliation, the careful choice of venue where they felt comfortable and confident. It had all been designed to put me in the right emotional state to say yes to their proposal. This is a lot to think about, I said carefully, not wanting to commit to anything while my emotions were in flux. Of course it is, Sarah agreed quickly. We're not asking for an immediate decision. We just wanted you to know that we've been thinking about solutions that could help everyone, and we hope you'll consider whether one of these approaches might work. Michael signaled for the check, clearly considering the business portion of the evening complete. The important thing is that we're all family, and we want to support each other through this difficult time. Family. There was that word again. deployed strategically whenever they needed something from me, absent during the years when I'd actually needed to feel like part of their family. As we prepared to leave the restaurant, Jennifer linked her arm through mine in a gesture of affection that would have meant everything to me 6 months earlier. "I'm so glad we had this chance to really talk," she said warmly. "I feel like this is the beginning of a much better relationship between all of us." Driving home through the quiet streets of Riverside, I tried to process what had just happened. Bob's children had spent the evening treating me better than they ever had during the 4 years I was married to their father. They'd shared memories, shown apparent affection, and presented themselves as a united family working together to solve a common problem. But underneath all that warmth and familial connection was a calculated request for me to leverage my home, my security, my independence to solve their financial problems. They wanted me to take on debt or sell part of my property to provide them with the inheritance their father's poor financial decisions had cost them. Back at Maplewood Manor, I walked through the rooms that Bob and I had shared, trying to imagine them burdened with a substantial mortgage payment or bordered by new residential development. The house had been in my family for 30 years, mortgage-free and peaceful, a sanctuary where I'd weathered 2 marriages, 1 death, and countless smaller challenges of daily life. Now Bob's children wanted me to risk that security, that peace, that independence, to solve problems that weren't of my making. And they wanted me to do it gladly, gratefully, as a loving gesture toward the family that had never quite wanted me as a member. I poured myself a glass of wine and sat in Bob's chair on the back porch, looking out at the garden we'd tended together. For the first time since his death, I felt angry rather than just sad. Angry at Bob for hiding his financial problems. Angry at his children for their years of rejection followed by sudden financial interest. And angry at myself for being moved by their apparent change of heart, even when I could see the manipulation behind it. But anger, I realized, was actually helpful. Anger gave me clarity that grief had obscured. I could see the situation for what it really was, make decisions based on facts rather than emotions or guilt. I was a 62-year-old woman with substantial assets and no children of my own to inherit them. I had every right to protect my financial security and make decisions based on my own needs rather than the expectations of people who had spent 4 years making it clear I wasn't really family. The question now was what I was going to do about it. The pressure began subtly the next week. It started with small gestures that could be interpreted as kindness or manipulation depending on your perspective. Sarah appeared at my door on Tuesday morning with fresh pastries from an expensive bakery downtown, explaining that she'd been in the neighborhood and thought I might enjoy something special for breakfast. We sat in my kitchen, the same kitchen where she'd barely acknowledged my presence during countless family gatherings, and she chatted about her work, her divorce, her concerns about raising her teenage daughter as a single mother. "Money has been so tight since Richard and I split up," she confided, stirring cream into her coffee with the kind of careful attention that suggested she was choosing her words deliberately. "I never realized how expensive everything would become. Emma's college fund took a hit during the divorce settlement, and now with Dad's situation, I keep wondering how I'm going to manage everything." I made appropriate sympathetic sounds while recognizing the subtext of her confession. Sarah was positioning herself as financially vulnerable, a struggling single mother who needed help. The implication was clear. Any assistance with Bob's estate debts would directly benefit not just her, but her innocent teenage daughter whose college prospects hung in the balance. "Emma's such a bright girl," Sarah continued, pulling out her phone to show me recent photos. "She has her heart set on studying pre-med at UC San Diego. The tuition costs are overwhelming, but her grades are perfect and she's worked so hard. I just hate the idea that Dad's financial problems might impact her future opportunities." Emma was indeed a lovely girl, and I'd always regretted that Bob's family dynamics had prevented me from developing any meaningful relationship with his granddaughter. Seeing her bright smile in the photos, hearing about her academic achievements and career aspirations, I felt the familiar tug of wanting to help, wanting to be the kind of step-grandmother who could make a difference in a young person's life. But I also recognized the emotional manipulation in Sarah's approach. She wasn't just asking for money, she was asking me to rescue her daughter's educational future. The guilt embedded in that request was sophisticated and powerful. What kind of person would prioritize their own financial security over a bright teenager's college dreams? Michael's approach was different but equally strategic. He called Thursday afternoon to ask if I needed any help with property maintenance, explaining that he'd been thinking about all the work that went into maintaining a historic home like Maplewood Manor. When I mentioned that I was planning to have the gutters cleaned, he immediately volunteered to handle it, arriving Saturday morning with professional equipment and 2 employees from his construction company. "This is really generous of you," I said, watching his crew work efficiently around the house. "I was planning to hire someone local." "Family helps family," Michael replied, the phrase carrying weight that seemed disproportionate to gutter cleaning. "Besides, I know Dad would want me to make sure you're taken care of." As his crew worked, Michael walked around the property, with the kind of attention I'd seen him pay to potential development sites. He examined the foundation, noted the mature trees, commented on the excellent drainage and soil conditions. His appreciation seemed genuine, but it also felt like a professional assessment, as if he were cataloging the property's assets and development potential. "You know," he said as we stood looking out at the back acres, "this land has incredible potential. The location is perfect, the infrastructure is already in place, and the zoning would allow for some really thoughtful residential development. Someone could create a beautiful small community here while preserving the historic character of the main house." I understood that he wasn't making idle conversation. Michael was showing me how easy it would be to convert part of my property into cash, how seamlessly development could be integrated without disrupting my daily life. He was making the solution to their inheritance problem seem not just feasible, but advantageous for everyone involved. "I've never really thought about development," I said honestly. "This has always just been home." "Of course," Michael agreed quickly, "and it always would be. But if you ever wanted to explore options, I could connect you with some excellent planners who specialize in preserving historical properties while maximizing land value." No pressure, just information. Jennifer's strategy was perhaps the most emotionally complex. She began stopping by regularly, ostensibly to check on my well-being, but actually to share increasingly personal details about her life and her relationship with Bob. These conversations revealed aspects of my late husband's character that he'd never shared with me directly, creating a strange intimacy between Jennifer and me based on our shared connection to a man we'd both loved in different ways. "Dad used to worry about you being alone in this big house after he was gone," Jennifer told me during one of these visits, her voice carrying the kind of gentle concern that made it difficult to question her motives. "He said you were so independent and capable, but he wished you had more family support. People who could help you navigate practical decisions as you get older." The irony of this statement wasn't lost on me. Bob's children had spent 4 years maintaining careful distance from me, and now Jennifer was suggesting that Bob had been concerned about my lack of family support. If he'd truly been worried about my isolation, he could have addressed it by encouraging his children to include me more fully in their family activities. "Did he really say that?" I asked, genuinely curious about whether this conversation had actually taken place or whether Jennifer was crafting it to serve her current purposes. "Many times," Jennifer assured me, "especially after he had that health scare last year. He said you were the strongest person he knew, but everyone needs people they can count on. He felt guilty that his kids hadn't been more welcoming, more available to support you." If this conversation had indeed happened, it raised uncomfortable questions about why Bob had never shared these concerns with me directly or taken steps to address the family dynamics that were causing him worry. But it also suggested that he'd been more aware of his children's behavior toward me than I'd realized, which was both validating and painful. He wanted us to be closer, Jennifer continued. He said he hoped that someday we could be the kind, a family where everyone looked out for each other, where his kids and his wife could depend on each other for support and guidance. The emotional weight of these alleged conversations was significant. Jennifer was painting a picture of Bob as a man who'd wanted his family unified, who'd hoped his death would bring us together rather than drive us further apart. She was positioning their current outreach to me not as financially motivated, but as the fulfillment of their father's dying wishes. By the end of the second week, I felt emotionally exhausted from managing these increasingly complex interactions. Each of Bob's children was approaching me with a different strategy, but all three approaches were designed to make me feel guilty about protecting my financial independence while they struggled with debt and reduced inheritance expectations. I decided I needed professional advice, someone who could help me understand both the legal and emotional aspects of my situation. I made an appointment with David Chen, asking him to explain my rights and obligations regarding Bob's estate in more detail. You have no legal obligation to use your personal assets to settle your late husband's debts, David explained clearly during our private meeting. Your property was owned independently before the marriage and remained in your name throughout the marriage. Bob's creditors have no claim on assets that were never jointly owned. This was relief I hadn't realized I needed to hear. The pressure from Bob's children had been so subtle and emotionally sophisticated that I'd begun to question whether I had moral, if not legal, obligations to help resolve their father's financial problems. What about the practical aspects? I asked. If I choose not to help, what happens to Bob's estate? The debts will be settled using whatever assets Bob did have, David replied. His creditors will receive partial payment, and the remainder of the debt will be written off. This happens frequently with estates that have been impacted by poor investment decisions or unexpected medical expenses. Bob's children will inherit nothing, but they also won't inherit responsibility for his remaining debts. I asked David about the home equity loan and partial property sale options that Bob's children had proposed. His response was professionally neutral, but personally revealing. Both options are financially feasible, he said. Your property value would easily support a substantial loan, and there's definitely development interest in your area. But I would strongly advise you to consider your long-term financial security and personal preferences before making any commitments. Once you take on mortgage debt at your age, you're changing your entire financial picture for the remainder of your life. David also recommended that I consult with a financial planner who specialized in retirement security, someone who could help me understand the full implications of leveraging my property for other people's benefit. He gave me the name of a woman named Patricia Reynolds, who had extensive experience helping widows navigate complex financial decisions. My appointment with Patricia was scheduled for the following week, but before I could meet with her, the situation with Bob's children escalated in a way I hadn't anticipated. I received a call from Jennifer on Friday afternoon, her voice tight with anxiety and what sounded like barely controlled anger. "Linda, we need to talk," she said without her usual preliminary pleasantries. "Something has happened that changes everything." Hauser, she explained that Bob's creditors had begun contacting his children directly, demanding information about estate assets and threatening legal action if debts weren't resolved quickly. Apparently, one of Bob's business loans had a personal guarantee that made his children potentially liable for a portion of the debt if the estate couldn't cover it. "We're talking about $40,000 each," Jennifer said, her voice shaking. "Money none of us have, especially with Michael's business struggling and Sarah's divorce expenses. We could lose our homes, Linda. We could be forced into bankruptcy because of Dad's financial mistakes." I felt a chill of real concern. If Bob's children were indeed personally liable for a portion of his business debts, then their financial distress was more serious than they'd initially indicated. This wasn't just about disappointed inheritance expectations. This was about potential financial ruin for all three of them. Are you sure about the personal guarantee? I asked. Have you verified this with an attorney? We're meeting with a lawyer Monday morning, Jennifer replied. But the creditor sent us copies of the loan documents, and Dad's signature is right there on the personal guarantee section. He must have signed it during the divorce proceedings when his credit was impacted, and he needed co-signers to qualify for business financing. The implications of this development were staggering. If Bob had indeed personally guaranteed business, loans that his estate couldn't cover, his children could be facing immediate financial crisis. Their recent attention to me and my property wasn't just about wanting inheritance money, it was about avoiding personal financial catastrophe. Jennifer, I'm so sorry, I said, and I meant it. This must be terrifying for all of you. Linda, we need your help, she said directly, abandoning the subtle approaches they'd been using for weeks. We're not asking you to give us money or sell your house or anything dramatic, but if you could consider taking out even a small home equity loan, just enough to settle this particular debt, it would save all three of us from bankruptcy. The desperation in her voice was genuine, and I felt the full weight of the moral dilemma they'd been carefully constructing for weeks. I had the means to help them avoid financial ruin, while helping them would put my own financial security at risk. The choice wasn't between my comfort and their convenience, it was between my independence and their survival. I need to understand the legal situation better before I can make any decisions, I said carefully. Can you send me copies of the documents you received? I want to have my attorney review everything. Of course, Jennifer agreed quickly. I'll email everything to you tonight. And Linda, I know this is a lot to ask. I know we haven't always been the most welcoming family members, but we're desperate, and you're the only person who can help us. After ending the call, I sat in my quiet house trying to process this new information. If Bob's children were telling the truth about the personal guarantees, then their situation was far more dire than I'd realized. Their recent outreach to me hadn't just been about greed or entitlement, it had been about survival. But I also couldn't ignore the possibility that this was another layer of manipulation, an escalation designed to create the kind of crisis that would make it impossible for me to refuse their requests. The timing was certainly convenient, coming just as I'd begun to establish boundaries and seek independent legal advice. I called Emma immediately, needing her perspective on this latest development. She listened to my account of Jennifer's call, with the kind of focused attention that told me she understood the significance of what I was describing. They're either in real trouble or they're very sophisticated manipulators, she said bluntly. Either way, you need to protect yourself by getting independent verification of everything they're telling you. Emma was right. Whether Bob's children were facing genuine financial crisis or manufacturing one for my benefit, I needed to understand the actual legal and financial facts before making any decisions that would impact my own security. But as I prepared for bed that night, I couldn't shake the image of Jennifer's voice breaking as she described the possibility of bankruptcy. If they were telling the truth, then my comfortable position as the wronged stepmother with all the financial power was about to become much more complicated. The documents Jennifer emailed that evening were extensive and appeared legitimate. Loan agreements, personal guarantee clauses, correspondence from creditors, and legal notices that certainly looked official. But I'd learned enough about manipulation over the past few weeks to know that documents could be created or selectively edited to support almost any narrative. I forwarded everything to David Chen with a request for immediate review and verification. If Bob's children were facing the kind of financial crisis they claimed, then I needed to understand my options and obligations quickly. If they weren't, then I needed to understand what kind of game they were playing and how to protect myself from it. Either way, the comfortable distance I'd been trying to maintain from their financial problems was about to become impossible to sustain. Whether I wanted to be involved or not, I was apparently the key to resolving a crisis that could destroy three people's financial lives. The question was whether I was being asked to be a savior or whether I was being positioned as the villain. in a story where refusing to help would make me responsible for their destruction, and I had less than a weekend to figure out the difference. David Chen called me at 7:30 Monday morning, his voice carrying the kind of urgency that made my stomach drop before he'd spoken a complete sentence. I was in my robe, coffee, barely started, when his call shattered what I'd hoped would be a peaceful morning of waiting for his legal review of the documents Jennifer had sent. "Linda, we need to meet immediately," he said without his usual professional pleasantries. "I've reviewed everything you forwarded, and there are serious discrepancies that you need to understand before you have any further contact with Bob's children." The tone of his voice told me everything I needed to know. This wasn't about clarifying legal obligations or helping me understand complex financial documents. This was about deception, manipulation, and probably fraud. "How serious?" I asked, setting down my coffee cup with hands that had begun to shake slightly. "Serious enough that I've already contacted the State Bar Association's fraud investigation unit," David replied. "Can you be in my office within an hour? And Linda, until we meet, don't respond to any calls, texts, or visits from Michael, Sarah, or Jennifer. Don't engage with them at all." I dressed quickly, my mind racing through the implications of David's warning. If he'd contacted fraud investigators, then the documents Bob's children had provided weren't just questionable. They were potentially criminal evidence. The desperation Jennifer had conveyed in her voice Friday afternoon, the apparent crisis that had made their requests seem reasonable and urgent, had been manufactured. David's office felt different that morning, charged with the kind of tension that comes when legal matters shift from civil to criminal. He had the documents I'd forwarded spread across his conference table, along with official forms and correspondence that I didn't recognize. "The personal guarantee documents they sent you are forgeries," David said without preamble, pointing to several pages of loan agreements. "Sophisticated forgeries, but forgeries nonetheless. I contacted the lending institution directly and, while Bob did have business loans with them, he never signed personal guarantees that would make his children liable for the debt." I stared at the papers, trying to process what he was telling me. "So there's no bankruptcy threat? No financial crisis?" "Not from these alleged loan guarantees," David confirmed. "Bob's children are not personally liable for any of his business debts. The estate will be settled exactly as I originally explained, with creditors receiving partial payment and the remainder of the debt being written off." The relief I felt was immediately complicated by anger and a sense of betrayal that went deeper than I'd expected. For weeks, Bob's children had been systematically manipulating me, escalating their emotional and financial pressure until they'd created a crisis designed to make refusal impossible. The apparent reconciliation, the family dinners, the shared memories, the expressions of love and regret, all of it had been theater designed to separate me from my property and financial security. "How sophisticated are we talking about?" I asked, needing to understand the extent of what they'd attempted. David showed me side-by-side comparisons of legitimate loan documents and the forgeries Jennifer had sent. "Professional quality," he said grimly. "These weren't created on someone's home computer. They used official letterhead, correct formatting, appropriate legal language. Someone with access to document creation software and knowledge of banking procedures created these specifically to deceive you." The implications were staggering. This wasn't a desperate plan hatched by grieving children who'd made poor decisions under emotional stress. This was a calculated fraud that had required planning, resources, and criminal intent. "What happens now?" I asked. "I've documented everything and provided copies to the appropriate authorities," David explained. "Whether criminal charges are filed will depend on how the investigation proceeds. But Linda, you need to understand that you've been the target of a sophisticated confidence scheme. Everything they've done over the past few weeks has been designed to manipulate you into transferring significant assets to them based on false pretenses." I thought about Sarah's visits with expensive pastries and stories about her daughter's college fund. Michael's helpful property maintenance and casual comments about development potential, Jennifer's intimate conversations about Bob's alleged concerns for my welfare. All of it had been performance, scripted and rehearsed to achieve a specific financial goal. How do I handle this? I asked. They don't know that I've discovered the fraud yet. David leaned forward, his expression serious. That's actually an advantage. The authorities would like your cooperation in documenting any further attempts at manipulation or fraud. If they contact you today, which they probably will given the urgency they've tried to create, we want you to listen but not commit to anything. He explained that I would be fitted with a recording device, that our conversation would be monitored by investigators, and that any admissions or additional deceptive statements could be used as evidence in potential criminal proceedings. The thought of wearing a wire to record conversations with Bob's children felt surreal, like something from a crime drama rather than a family dispute. But I realized that this had stopped being a family matter weeks ago when they'd decided to commit fraud to get what they wanted. 2 hours later, I was back at Maplewood Manor with a tiny recording device taped to my chest and a team of investigators positioned in an unmarked van down the street. The normalcy of my surroundings felt absurd given the circumstances. I was in my own kitchen, surrounded by familiar objects and routine comforts, preparing to record evidence of criminal activity by my deceased husband's children. The call came at 11:15, exactly when David had predicted it would. Jennifer's voice carried the same desperate urgency from Friday, but now I could hear the calculated performance underneath the apparent emotion. "Linda, thank God you're home," she began. "We met with the attorney this morning, and the situation is even worse than we thought. The creditors are demanding immediate payment, and if we can't settle within 2 weeks, they're going to start garnishing our wages and putting liens on our homes." I made appropriate sympathetic sounds while watching the recording device monitor to ensure it was capturing everything clearly. The attorney said our only option is to either pay the $40,000 each immediately or file for bankruptcy protection. Jennifer continued, "Linda, we're desperate. We've talked to everyone we know, explored every option, and you're the only person who can help us avoid losing everything." The irony of her statement wasn't lost on me. I was indeed the only person who could help them, but not in the way she intended. I was the only person who could provide evidence of their fraud to prevent them from victimizing someone else. "Jennifer, this is such a difficult situation," I said carefully, following the script David and I had rehearsed. "I want to help, but taking on a significant loan at my age is frightening. Can you help me understand exactly what would be required?" "Just a home equity loan for $120,000, she replied quickly. "It sounds like a lot, but given your property value, the monthly payments would be very manageable. And Linda, this isn't just about us. This is about honoring Dad's memory, making sure his financial mistakes don't destroy the family he loved." The manipulation was so smooth, so practiced, that I might have believed it if I hadn't known the truth. Jennifer was combining emotional blackmail with false urgency, using Bob's memory as leverage while creating a fictional crisis that demanded immediate action. "I understand the time pressure," I said, "but I need to see the actual legal documents before I can make a decision this significant. Could you bring me copies of everything the attorney showed you?" There was a pause, and I could almost hear Jennifer calculating how to respond to this reasonable request. "Of course," she said, finally. "Actually, Michael and Sarah are here with me now. Could we all come over this afternoon? We could walk through everything together, answer all your questions, and maybe even contact some lenders to get the loan process started if you're comfortable moving forward." They wanted to finalize everything immediately, create momentum. That would make it difficult for me to change my mind or seek independent advice. The pressure tactics were becoming increasingly obvious now that I understood what I was looking for. "That would be very helpful," I agreed. "Could you come around 2 o'clock? That would give me time to gather my financial documents in case we need them for loan applications." After ending the call, I sat in my quiet house waiting for the investigators to review the recording and provide guidance for the afternoon confrontation. The woman I'd been just a few hours earlier, confused and pressured by apparent family obligations, felt like a stranger now. I understood clearly that Bob's children had never seen me as family, had never experienced genuine reconciliation or affection for me. I had been a mark, a target, a problem to be solved through manipulation and fraud. The lead investigator, Detective Maria Santos, arrived at 1 o'clock to brief me on the afternoon's plan. She was a compact woman in her 40s with the kind of direct communication style that I found reassuring after weeks of navigating subtle deceptions. "They're going to pressure you hard this afternoon," she warned. "They've invested significant time and resources in this fraud, and they're not going to give up easily when they think they're close to success." Detective Santos explained that they wanted me to express interest in helping while asking detailed questions about the legal documents and loan processes. The more specific information Bob's children provided about their fictitious crisis, the stronger the evidence would be for criminal prosecution. "What if they become suspicious?" I asked. "What if they realize I'm not as naive as they think?" "I am?" "Then we move to arrest them immediately," she replied matter-of-factly. "We have enough evidence for charges based on the forged documents alone. But if we can get them to provide additional false information or make admissions about their planning, it strengthens the case significantly." At exactly 2 o'clock, all 3 of Bob's children arrived at my front door. They appeared anxious but determined, carrying folders of documents and wearing expressions of gratitude mixed with desperation. If I hadn't known the truth, their performance would have been completely convincing. "Linda, I can't tell you how much this means to us," Sarah said, embracing me with what felt like genuine warmth. "Dad would be so proud to know that his wife stepped up to help his children when we needed it most." We gathered in my living room, the same room where they'd excluded me from family photos just weeks earlier, and they spread their fraudulent documents across my coffee table with the efficiency of a practiced sales presentation. "This is the court order requiring immediate payment," Michael explained, showing me an official-looking document that I now knew was completely fabricated. "And this is the attorney's letter explaining our liability under the personal guarantee Dad signed." Jennifer pulled out what appeared to be bank statements showing their current financial situations, all indicating that they lacked the resources to meet the alleged creditor demands. The level of detail in their deception was impressive and deeply disturbing. "The good news is that we've already contacted several lenders about your home equity loan options," Sarah said, producing pre-printed loan applications with my name and property information already filled in. "Given Maplewood Manor's appraised value, you could qualify for up to $2 million in credit, though we'd only need a fraction of that." The loan applications were real, which meant they'd been researching my financial options and property value long before the alleged crisis had emerged. This wasn't a desperate response to unexpected legal problems. This was a long-term strategy that had been in development since they'd learned about my property's worth. "I have to admit, I'm nervous about taking on debt at my age," I said, following Detective Santos's guidance to express concern while maintaining interest. "What happens if something goes wrong? What if I can't make the payments?" "Linda, that's not going to happen," Michael assured me with the confidence of someone who'd clearly rehearsed this conversation. "Your property value provides enormous security. Even if you had trouble with payments, which you won't, you could always sell a portion of the land to pay off the loan." There it was. The suggestion that I could sell part of my property if needed wasn't backup planning. It was the actual goal. They wanted me to take on debt that would eventually force me to sell land, providing them with the proceeds while saddle me with financial obligations that would consume my remaining years. "And we want you to know that this isn't charity," Jennifer added. "We're planning to pay you back as soon as we can get our finances stabilized. This is more like a family loan than a gift." The promise of repayment was obviously meaningless. since the crisis requiring the loan was fictional, but it was designed to make me feel better about being manipulated. They were offering me the illusion of temporary sacrifice while planning permanent theft. Could I see the original loan documents that Dad signed? I asked, knowing that this request would create problems for them. I'd like to understand exactly what he committed to. The three siblings exchanged glances, and I could see them calculating how to respond to this reasonable but problematic request. The attorney has the originals, Michael said finally, but these copies show all the relevant information. I understand, but for something this significant, I'd really prefer to see the actual documents Dad signed. Could we arrange to meet with your attorney directly? Another pause, longer this time. They'd created fictional legal representation along with fictional loan guarantees, and my request to verify their claims directly was exposing the weaknesses in their deception. The attorney is extremely busy, Sarah said carefully. And honestly, Linda, we're running out of time to arrange the loan and get this settled. The creditors won't wait for us to schedule meetings and review documents. The pressure was escalating exactly as Detective Santos had predicted. They were trying to create urgency that would prevent me from verifying their claims or seeking independent advice. I understand the time pressure, I replied calmly, but this is a huge decision for me. I need to be completely comfortable with all the legal and financial aspects before I sign anything. Jennifer leaned forward, her expression shifting to something more intense than the desperate gratitude she'd been displaying. Linda, I hope you understand what's at stake here. If we can't resolve this debt situation, we don't just lose money. We lose our homes, our ability to support our children, our entire financial futures. Dad's mistakes will destroy 3 families. The emotional manipulation was becoming more aggressive, the implied guilt more direct. They were abandoning subtle persuasion for overt pressure, suggesting that I would be responsible for their destruction if I didn't immediately agree to their demands. And we need to be realistic about something else, Michael added, his tone becoming cooler and more businesslike. Dad lived at Maplewood Manor for 4 years. He contributed to the property's maintenance, helped with improvements, invested time and energy in making it beautiful. Morally, if not legally, his estate has some claim on the increased value that occurred during his residence. Now they were threatening me directly, suggesting that they had legitimate claims on my property based on Bob's residence there. This was a significant escalation from requesting help to demanding what they claimed was rightfully theirs. I could see Detective Santos's unmarked van through my front window and knew that everything was being recorded. These direct threats and escalating demands were exactly the kind of evidence that would support serious criminal charges. I think I need to talk to my own attorney before making any decisions, I said, testing their reaction to this boundary. The temperature in the room seemed to drop perceptibly. Sarah's expression hardened, and Michael's professional demeanor disappeared entirely. Linda, Jennifer said, her voice carrying a warning that was barely concealed. I hope you're not going to let lawyers and bureaucrats prevent you from doing the right thing for Dad's family. The mask was slipping. The desperate, grateful children who needed my help were revealing themselves as people who believed they were entitled to my assets and were prepared to take them by force if manipulation didn't work. That's when I made my decision. I was done being their victim. I stood up from my chair with a calmness that surprised even me, looking at each of Bob's children in turn. The woman who had spent weeks being manipulated, pressured, and deceived was gone. In her place was someone who understood exactly what was happening and was ready to end it. I think it's time for honesty, I said quietly, my voice carrying a strength I hadn't known I possessed. Jennifer, would you like to explain why the personal guarantee documents you sent me are forgeries? The silence that followed was absolute. I watched 3 faces cycle through surprise, denial, calculation, And finally, a cold anger that revealed who they really were beneath all the performance and manipulation. Michael was the first to recover, his business instincts kicking in as he tried to salvage their operation. "Linda, I don't know what you think you've discovered, but you're obviously confused about complex legal documents." "Am I?" I walked to my kitchen counter and returned with a folder I'd prepared. Because I had an interesting conversation with the lending institution this morning. They confirmed that while Bob did have business loans, he never signed personal guarantees that would make his children liable for any portion of the debt. Sarah's face had gone pale, but Jennifer's expression was hardening into something that made me glad I wasn't facing this confrontation alone. "You had no right to investigate our private financial matters," she said, her voice tight with anger. "I had every right to verify information before mortgaging my home to pay fictional debts," I replied evenly. "Just like I had the right to discover that your attorney doesn't exist, your court orders are fabricated, and your entire crisis is a fraud designed to steal my property." The pretense was over. Michael stood abruptly, his demeanor shifting, from concerned stepson to something much more threatening. "You have no idea what you're dealing with, Linda. Dad's estate is more complicated than you understand, and our claims on this property are legitimate whether you want to acknowledge them or not." "What claims?" I asked, genuinely curious about how far they were prepared to take their deception. "Bob was a tenant in my home. He contributed nothing to the purchase price, the mortgage payments, or the property taxes. He has no legal claim on assets I owned before our marriage." "Legal claims aren't the only kind that matter," Sarah said, her voice carrying a venom I'd never heard before. "Dad invested 4 years of his life in this place. He made improvements, contributed to maintenance, helped create the value you're now hoarding for yourself." The transformation was remarkable. These were the same people who had excluded me from family gatherings, who had made it clear I wasn't really part of their family, who had treated me like an unwelcome intruder in their father's life. Now they were claiming that Bob's minimal contributions to household maintenance gave them ownership rights to my family estate. "Bob changed light bulbs and helped with gardening," I said calmly. "That doesn't create property rights." Jennifer stepped closer, and I could see something dangerous in her expression. "You're making a serious mistake, Linda. We've been patient with you, tried to work with you, offered you generous terms for helping family. But if you're going to be unreasonable, if you're going to let greed override family loyalty, then we'll have to explore other options." "What other options?" I asked, though I suspected I already knew. Michael produced a document from his folder, spreading it on my coffee table with the confidence of someone playing what he believed was a winning card. Bob updated his will 3 months before he died. This document gives his children significant rights regarding any property he occupied during his marriage. I looked at the paper he'd placed before me, recognizing immediately that it was another forgery, though more sophisticated than their previous attempts. The document purported to be a codicil to Bob's will, claiming that he'd established joint ownership rights to Maplewood Manor based on his residence there. "This is interesting," I said, pulling out my phone, "because I happen to have Bob's actual attorney on speed dial, and I'm quite confident he never prepared any such document." Sarah grabbed for my phone, but I stepped back quickly. "Don't," I warned, my voice carrying an authority that stopped her mid-reach. "You've already committed multiple felonies today. Assault would just add to your legal problems." "You're bluffing," Michael said, but there was uncertainty in his voice now. "You wouldn't call the police on Dad's children. I wouldn't call the police on family," I agreed. "But you stopped being family the moment you decided to defraud me. You forged legal documents, created fictional crises, and threatened me in my own home. You're criminals who happen to be related to my late husband." The truth of that statement hit all of us simultaneously. Whatever relationship we might have built over the years, whatever potential existed for genuine family connection, had been destroyed by their decision to treat me as a mark rather than a person. Jennifer's mask slipped completely, revealing a rage that was both frightening and illuminating. "You sanctimonious bitch," she hissed. "You think you're better than us because you inherited money you didn't earn? You married 2 men for their assets, and now you want to play victim when someone calls you on it." The accusation was so far from reality that it would have been laughable under different circumstances. I'd inherited Maplewood Manor from Carlos because we'd been married for 22 years and had built our life together. I'd married Bob because I loved him, despite the challenges his children presented. But Jennifer's words revealed how they'd always seen me, as a gold digger who had manipulated their way into their father's life for financial gain. "Is that what you really think?" I asked, genuinely curious about the narrative they'd constructed to justify their behavior. "We know what you are," Sarah said, her voice carrying years of resentment I was only now fully understanding. "Dad was vulnerable after the divorce, and you took advantage of that vulnerability to secure yourself financially. Now you want to act like you're the injured party when we try to protect our family's interests." The psychological projection was stunning. They were describing their own behavior, targeting someone they perceived as vulnerable for financial gain while attributing it to me. In their minds, I was the predator and they were the victims, which justified any action they took to recover what they believed was rightfully theirs. "Your family's interests," I repeated. "You mean the money. You think you should inherit from a man who died in debt?" "We mean the assets that should have been part of Dad's estate if you hadn't manipulated him into leaving everything to you," Michael said, his voice rising with frustration. "I didn't inherit anything from Bob," I pointed out. "He died in debt. Remember, his estate has no assets to distribute." "Because you kept your assets separate," Jennifer accused. "Because you made sure Dad couldn't claim any portion of your wealth even though he lived here and contributed to this household." I stared at her, finally understanding the depth of their resentment. They believed I'd deliberately structured my marriage to prevent Bob from accessing my property, that I'd been calculating and selfish in protecting my financial independence. The irony was that they were right about my caution, but wrong about my motives. I'd maintained separate finances, not to exclude Bob, but to protect both of us from exactly the kind of family financial drama that was now playing out. "You're absolutely right," I said calmly. "I did keep my assets separate. I did protect my financial independence. I did make sure that my property remained mine regardless of what happened in my marriage." My admission seemed to surprise them. They'd expected denial or defensiveness, not confirmation of their accusations. "And do you know why I did that?" I continued. "Because I'd already been widowed once. Because I'd already learned that financial security in later life is fragile and precious. Because I knew that marriage at 60 is different from marriage at 25, and protecting yourself isn't selfish. It's necessary." I walked to my front window, looking out at the garden Bob and I had tended together, the roses that were blooming despite his absence. But mostly, I protected my assets because I had excellent instincts about the kind of people who might try to take advantage of a vulnerable widow. The implication hung in the air between us. I'd been right to protect myself, and the evidence was sitting in my living room threatening me with forged documents. Michael stood up, his posture becoming more aggressive. "This conversation is over. Linda, you have 24 hours to reconsider your position. We've tried to work with you, but if you insist on being unreasonable, we'll pursue our legal rights through other channels." "What legal rights?" I asked again. "What other channels?" Sarah gathered their fraudulent documents with hands that were shaking slightly. "There are ways to challenge the validity of property ownership when undue influence can be demonstrated. Dad was vulnerable when he married you, and if we can show that you manipulated him financially. They were threatening to contest my ownership of property I'd owned for 30 years, property that predated my relationship with Bob by decades. The legal basis for such a challenge was non-existent, but I understood that they were prepared to drag me through expensive, lengthy litigation designed to force me into a settlement. You would lie in court? I asked. You would commit perjury to steal my home? We would tell the truth about your manipulation of our father, Jennifer replied coldly. We would make sure everyone understands exactly what kind of person you are. The threat was clear. They would destroy my reputation, drag me through public legal proceedings, and force me to spend enormous amounts of money defending property rights that were absolutely clear and legal. Even if I ultimately prevailed, the process would be devastating, personally and financially. That's when I realized I was done being afraid of them. Done being manipulated, threatened, or intimidated. Done allowing their anger and entitlement to make me question my own rights and decisions. Actually, I said, walking to my front door and opening it wide, I think you should leave now. And I think you should know that this entire conversation has been recorded. I pulled the small recording device from beneath my shirt, holding it up for them to see. Their faces went through a remarkable series of expressions as they processed the implications of what I'd just revealed. You recorded us? Sarah asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Every word, I confirmed. Every threat. Every forged document. Every admission of fraud. All of it documented and already in the hands of law enforcement. As if summoned by my words, Detective Santos appeared in my doorway, flanked by 2 uniformed officers. Michael Thompson, Sarah Thompson-Wells, Jennifer Thompson, you're under arrest for conspiracy to commit fraud, forgery, and attempted extortion. The next few minutes were surreal. Bob's children, who had spent weeks positioning themselves as loving family members worried about their father's legacy, were handcuffed in my living room while Detective Santos read them their rights. The fraudulent documents were collected as evidence, and I was told I would need to provide a detailed statement about the entire sequence of events. As they were led away, Jennifer turned back to look at me with an expression of pure hatred. "This isn't over," she called out. "You'll regret this." "No," I replied calmly. "I don't think I will." After the police cars pulled away from my driveway, I stood in my quiet house trying to process what had just happened. The woman who had been grieving her husband's death while struggling to find her place in his family was gone. In her place was someone who had discovered that she was stronger, smarter, and more resilient than she'd ever imagined. The silence of my house felt different now. Not empty or lonely, but peaceful in a way it hadn't been since Bob's death. I walked through the rooms we'd shared, touching familiar objects and remembering moments of genuine happiness we'd experienced together. Bob had been a good man, caught between conflicting loyalties, a father who'd loved his children despite their flaws, and a husband who'd cared for me despite the complications our marriage had created within his family. I found myself wondering if Bob had known about his children's true character, if he'd suspected they might target me after his death. There had been moments during our marriage when he'd seemed protective of my independence, encouraging me to maintain separate finances and legal ownership of Maplewood Manor. At the time, I'd attributed this to his own painful experience with divorce and financial entanglement. Now, I wondered if he'd been trying to protect me from something he'd hoped would never materialize but feared might. The investigation that followed revealed layers of deception that went far beyond what I'd experienced. Detective Santos called me 3 days after the arrests to provide an update on what they'd discovered during the initial phase of their investigation. "Linda, I need you to understand that what happened to you was part of a much larger pattern," she explained during our meeting at the police station. "We've been investigating this family for months based on complaints from other victims. You weren't their first target, and you probably wouldn't have been their last if we hadn't intervened when we did." She showed me files containing reports from elderly individuals across 3 counties who had been approached by one or more of Bob's children, with various schemes designed to separate them from their assets. A widower in San Bernardino had been convinced to invest his life savings in Michael's development projects that existed only on paper. A retired teacher in Riverside had been manipulated by Sarah into providing a substantial loan for her daughter's fictional medical emergency. Jennifer had been investigated for financial abuse of several elderly clients during her years as a substitute teacher, though charges had never been filed due to insufficient evidence. The sophistication of their approach to you suggests they'd been planning this operation for months, Detective Santos continued. The forged documents, the coordinated emotional manipulation, the research into your financial situation, this wasn't a desperate response to their father's death. This was a calculated criminal enterprise that used Bob's relationship with you as their entry point. Learning about their other victims was both validating and horrifying. Validating because it confirmed that I hadn't been paranoid or overly suspicious in my assessment of their behavior. Horrifying because it revealed the extent of suffering they'd caused other people, elderly individuals who didn't have the resources or support systems I'd been able to access. What happens to the other victims? I asked. Most of the money is gone, Detective Santos admitted. Michael's development company was essentially a shell operation for laundering stolen funds. Sarah's personal expenses consumed most of what she obtained through her schemes. Jennifer was more careful about hiding her theft, but even her victims are unlikely to see significant recovery. The financial losses were devastating for these individuals, but the emotional damage was perhaps worse. Detective Santos described elderly people who had been isolated from their actual families, convinced that well-meaning relatives were obstacles to their financial success, manipulated into making decisions that destroyed their security and independence. The psychological techniques Bob's children had used were sophisticated and cruel, designed to exploit the specific vulnerabilities of aging individuals who were already dealing with loss, loneliness, and declining physical capabilities. How many people are we talking about? I asked. 17 that we've identified so far, she replied. Probably more who haven't come forward yet. Financial abuse of the elderly is significantly underreported because victims often feel ashamed that they were deceived. I sat in Detective Santos's office trying to process the scope of what I'd unknowingly become involved in. I'd thought I was dealing with difficult stepchildren who had become desperate after their father's death. Instead, I'd been targeted by experienced criminals who had been systematically victimizing vulnerable elderly people for years. The legal proceedings that followed were complex and lengthy. Bob's children were charged with multiple felonies across several jurisdictions, and the evidence against them included not just the recordings from our confrontation, but extensive financial records, communications with other victims, and testimony from people who had been too frightened or embarrassed to come forward previously. Michael's construction business was revealed to be largely fraudulent, existing primarily to provide legitimacy for his investment schemes and to launder money obtained from elderly victims. Sarah's divorce had been financially motivated rather than emotionally driven, designed to protect assets from potential criminal liability by transferring them to her ex-husband's name. Jennifer's teaching career had provided her with access to elderly substitute teaching clients, many of whom had been targeted for financial exploitation. The trial began 8 months after their arrest, and I was called as a witness to describe my experiences and provide testimony about the systematic nature of their approach. Sitting in that courtroom, looking at Bob's children dressed in conservative clothing and attempting to project remorse and respectability, I felt a complex mixture of emotions. There was satisfaction in seeing justice being pursued, relief that they would be prevented from victimizing other people, and a strange sadness for the family relationships that might have been possible if they had chosen different paths. These were Bob's children, people he had loved and worried about, people who might have become meaningful parts of my life if they hadn't been committed to criminal behavior. During my testimony, the defense attorneys attempted to portray me as a wealthy woman who had been unreasonably suspicious of her stepchildren's legitimate concerns about their father's estate. They suggested that I had overreacted to normal family dynamics and had entrapped Bob's children into making statements that sounded more sinister than they actually were. But the evidence was overwhelming. The forged documents, the fictional legal crises, the coordinated manipulation tactics, and the pattern of similar behavior with other victims made it impossible to characterize their actions as anything other than systematic criminal fraud. The prosecutor, a sharp woman named Rebecca Martinez, who specialized in elder abuse cases, presented a compelling narrative about the sophisticated nature of their operation and the devastating impact on victims who had trusted them. The defendants didn't just steal money, she explained to the jury during her closing argument. They stole security, independence, and dignity from people who had spent lifetimes building the resources they needed for their retirement years. They exploited relationships, manufactured crises, and used psychological manipulation techniques to convince their victims that protecting their own assets was selfish and wrong. The jury deliberated for 2 days before returning guilty verdicts on multiple charges. Michael received a sentence of 6 years in state prison and was ordered to pay restitution to his victims. Sarah received 4 years and similar restitution requirements. Jennifer, whose crimes were considered less extensive but more personally violating due to her professional relationship with some victims, received 3 years. The sentences felt appropriate but insufficient given the scope of damage they'd caused. Financial restitution was largely symbolic, since most of the stolen money had been spent, and no amount of punishment could restore the sense of security and trust that their victims had lost. After the trial concluded, I received letters from several of the other victims who had testified. These were people in their 70s and 80s who had lost life savings, been forced to sell homes, or had seen their retirement plans destroyed by Bob's children's schemes. Their letters were heartbreaking but also inspiring, describing how they had found the courage to testify despite their embarrassment and fear. One letter particularly moved me. It was from an 82-year-old man named Frank Morrison, whose wife had died the same year as Bob. He had been approached by Sarah with a story about needing emergency funding for her daughter's cancer treatment, and he had liquidated his retirement accounts to provide what he believed was a compassionate loan to a family in crisis. When the fictional medical emergency turned into demands for additional funding, and Sarah became increasingly aggressive about timelines and secrecy, Frank had realized he was being victimized, but felt too ashamed to report it immediately. "Your courage in fighting back gave me the strength to come forward," he wrote. "I kept thinking that if a woman your age could face down these criminals and win, then maybe I could find the courage to help stop them from hurting other people. Thank you for showing me that being a victim doesn't mean being powerless." Reading Frank's letter, I realized that my experience had become something larger than a personal family conflict. By refusing to be manipulated, and by working with law enforcement to expose the fraud, I had helped protect other potential victims and provided validation for people who had already been harmed. The emotional healing took longer than the legal resolution. For months after the trial, I found myself second-guessing interactions with service providers, neighbors, and even friends, wondering if their interest in my well-being was genuine or financially motivated. The experience had damaged my ability to trust, leaving me hypervigilant about people's motives and suspicious of anyone who showed unexpected kindness or interest in my life. Emma stayed with me for a week after the trial ended, helping me process what had happened and begin to rebuild my sense of normalcy. We spent hours talking about the warning signs I'd missed, the moments when I'd allowed guilt and loneliness to override my instincts, and the ways that societal expectations about family obligations had made me vulnerable to manipulation. "You weren't naive," Emma insisted during one of our conversations. "You were hopeful. You wanted to believe that Bob's children could become your family, that his death could bring you all closer together instead of driving you apart. That's not weakness, Linda. That's humanity." Emma's perspective helped me understand that being targeted by sophisticated criminals didn't reflect poorly on my judgment or intelligence. Bob's children had been successful in victimizing multiple people because they were skilled at identifying and exploiting normal human emotions: grief, loneliness, guilt, and the desire for family connection. The remarkable thing, Emma continued, is how quickly you recognized what was happening once you had enough information. Most people would have continued trying to make it work, would have convinced themselves that family obligations required them to help even when the situation didn't make sense. She was right. While I'd initially been vulnerable to their manipulation, I'd also developed the skills and confidence necessary to fight back effectively once I understood what I was dealing with. The nursing background that had taught me to gather information, assess situations systematically, and make decisions under pressure had served me well in navigating a criminal investigation. A year after the trial, I decided to become involved in elder abuse prevention education. Detective Santos connected me with a nonprofit organization that provided resources and support for elderly individuals who had been victimized by financial fraud, and I began volunteering as a speaker at community events and support groups. Sharing my story with other elderly individuals was both difficult and rewarding. Many people expressed disbelief that such sophisticated schemes were targeting their demographic, and others shared their own experiences with family members, caregivers, or service providers who had attempted to manipulate them financially. The most meaningful conversations were with people who were currently dealing with pressure from family members to make financial decisions that didn't feel right. I learned to help them identify the warning signs I'd missed initially: sudden increases in attention and affection, requests for immediate decisions without time for independent consultation, emotional manipulation designed to create guilt about protecting personal assets, and pressure to keep financial discussions secret from other people who might provide perspective. Trust your instincts, I would tell them. If something feels wrong, it probably is. If someone is pressuring you to make immediate financial decisions, that pressure itself is a red flag. Legitimate opportunities and genuine emergencies allow time for verification and consultation. These presentations also helped me understand how common my experience had been. Financial abuse of elderly individuals was significantly more widespread than I'd realized, and much of it was perpetrated by family members who justified their behavior as protecting inheritance, preventing waste, or ensuring appropriate care for aging relatives. 2 years after Bob's death, I received an unexpected visitor. Emma Thompson, Bob's granddaughter and Sarah's daughter, appeared at my door one afternoon looking nervous but determined. She was 20 now, a junior at UC San Diego studying pre-med as her mother had described, but paying for her education through scholarships and part-time work, rather than through the money her mother had attempted to steal from me. "Mrs. Martinez," she began formally, "I hope you don't mind me coming here. I wanted to apologize for what my mother and aunt and uncle did to you, and I wanted you to know that not everyone in our family supported their actions." I invited Emma in, curious about her perspective on the events that had destroyed any possibility of family relationships between Bob's children and me. She was a poised young woman with Bob's eyes and an earnestness that reminded me of him at his best. "I knew something was wrong when Mom started talking about you differently after Grandpa died," Emma explained. "For years, she'd complained about you being gold digger and an outsider, but suddenly she was talking about family obligations and how much Grandpa had loved you. It didn't make sense." Emma described watching her mother's behavior become increasingly erratic and secretive, noting the expensive clothes and restaurant meals that appeared despite Sarah's claims of financial hardship, and observing the family meetings that excluded her, but seemed to generate significant excitement and planning activity. "When I found out what they'd done, I was horrified," she continued. "Grandpa Bob loved you. Anyone who spent time with you two together could see that. He was happier during those 4 years than he'd been since the divorce. What they did wasn't just criminal. It was a betrayal of everything he cared about." Emma's visit provided a perspective on Bob that I'd never heard from any other family member. She described a grandfather who had spoken proudly about his marriage to me, who had found peace and contentment at Maplewood Manor, and who had worried about his children's financial irresponsibility and poor decision-making. He knew Mom had money problems, But he didn't know how to help without enabling bad choices, Emma explained. He used to say that giving people money they hadn't earned often hurt them more than it helped them. I think he would have been proud of you for refusing to be manipulated. Our conversation lasted several hours, and by the end of it, I felt like I'd recovered a piece of Bob that his children's actions had taken from me. Emma's description of her grandfather matched the man I'd married. Thoughtful, principled, loving, but not naive about human nature. "I'd like to stay in touch with you," Emma said as she prepared to leave. "I know the situation with my family makes that complicated, but you were important to Grandpa, and I think he would want us to know each other." I agreed, recognizing that Emma represented the positive potential that had always existed within Bob's family, but had been overshadowed by her relative's criminal behavior. Over the following months, we developed a genuine friendship based on shared memories of Bob and mutual respect, rather than obligation or manipulation. Emma's occasional visits became one of the unexpected gifts that emerged from the wreckage of my relationship with Bob's children. She would stop by when she was home from college, helping with garden projects that were becoming more challenging for me to manage alone, sharing stories about her studies and career plans, and providing the kind of intergenerational connection that had been missing from my life since Bob's death. 3 years after the arrests, Michael was released on parole after serving 4 years of his sentence. Sarah had been released 6 months earlier, and Jennifer was scheduled for release within the year. Detective Santos contacted me to inform me of Michael's release and to discuss safety precautions, though she assured me that none of them had made any threats or shown any indication of planning retaliation. "In my experience," she explained, "people like Bob's children are primarily focused on their own survival and comfort. They're unlikely to risk returning to prison by engaging in additional criminal behavior, especially behavior that doesn't offer financial gain. Nevertheless, I upgraded my home security system and made sure my neighbors were aware of the situation." Pat Morrison had moved to assisted living the previous year, but her replacement neighbors, a young family named the Garcias, were friendly and attentive to the neighborhood dynamics. The first contact came not from Michael, Sarah, or Jennifer directly, but from an attorney representing them in a civil matter. 6 months after Michael's release, I received a formal letter demanding that I provide financial compensation for their wrongful imprisonment and requesting a meeting to discuss resolution of outstanding family obligations. I forwarded the letter to my attorney, who confirmed that it was essentially meaningless legally, but represented an attempt to pressure me into providing money to avoid harassment. The letter contained no specific threats, but the implication was clear. They were attempting to resume their manipulation tactics through legal intimidation. "They're testing to see if you're still vulnerable to their pressure," my attorney explained. "The best response is no response. Any engagement with them, even through legal channels, signals that their tactics might be effective." I followed his advice and ignored the letter entirely. No follow-up correspondence arrived, suggesting that their attempt to restart their manipulation had been half-hearted and opportunistic, rather than committed and systematic. The 5th anniversary of Bob's death passed quietly, marked by a private visit to his grave and an evening spent reviewing photo albums from our years together. I'd kept the pictures that showed genuine moments of happiness and connection, discarding the formal family portraits that had always felt forced and uncomfortable. Looking through those photos, I could see the evolution of my relationship with Bob and the gradual recognition that his children would never accept me as family. But I could also see moments of real joy and partnership, evidence that our marriage had been meaningful and valuable despite the complications it had created. That evening, Emma called to check on me, knowing that anniversary dates could be emotionally difficult. We talked about Bob's legacy, the positive impact he'd had on both our lives, and the ways that his memory continued to influence our decisions and perspectives. "I think Grandpa would be proud of how you handled everything," Emma said. "He always said that strength wasn't about avoiding difficult situations, but about facing them with integrity and courage. You did exactly that. At 72, I found myself in a position I never could have imagined during those first confused and painful months after Bob's death. I was financially secure, emotionally independent, and surrounded by genuine relationships based on mutual respect rather than manipulation or obligation. The house that Bob's children had tried to steal remained my sanctuary, filled with memories of 2 loving marriages and decades of personal growth. The garden Bob and I had tended together continued to flourish under my care, though I'd hired help for the more physically demanding maintenance tasks. The roses we'd planted during his final spring were now mature and abundant, providing constant reminders of the beauty that could grow from love and attention. Most significantly, I'd discovered capabilities within myself that I'd never been forced to develop during my years as a wife and caregiver. The strategic thinking, emotional resilience, and personal strength I'd accessed during the confrontation with Bob's children had become permanent aspects of my personality rather than emergency responses to crisis. I'd learned to trust my instincts, question information that seemed too convenient or emotionally manipulative, and prioritize my own well-being without guilt or apology. These weren't selfish traits. They were survival skills that had protected me from becoming another victim of financial elder abuse. The speaking engagements I'd undertaken had evolved into a more formal role as an elder advocate and educator. I worked with law enforcement agencies to help them understand the sophisticated nature of modern financial fraud targeting elderly individuals, and I consulted with adult protective services on cases involving suspected family manipulation. This work provided meaning and purpose that had been missing from my retirement years, connecting me with communities of people who shared my commitment to protecting vulnerable individuals from exploitation. It also reminded me regularly that my experience, while traumatic, had equipped me with knowledge and perspective that could benefit others facing similar challenges. On quiet evenings at Maplewood Manor, I sometimes reflected on the alternative timeline that might have unfolded if I'd been less suspicious, less determined to verify information independently, or more susceptible to guilt and family pressure. I might have mortgaged my home to pay fictional debts, sold portions of my property to resolve manufactured crises, or gradually transferred my assets to people who viewed me as a source of funding rather than a family member. The woman I'd been at the beginning of this ordeal might have made those choices. The widow struggling with grief and loneliness, desperate for family acceptance and connection, vulnerable to manipulation by people who claimed to love her. That woman might have sacrificed her security and independence for the illusion of belonging to a family that had never really wanted her. But I wasn't that woman anymore. The experience had forced me to develop strength, wisdom, and self-respect that had transformed not just how I dealt with manipulation and fraud, but how I approached every aspect of my life. I'd learned that protecting myself wasn't selfish, that trusting my instincts wasn't paranoid, and that demanding respect wasn't unreasonable. The greatest victory hadn't been seeing Bob's children imprisoned or preventing them from stealing my assets. The greatest victory had been discovering that I was worth protecting, that my security and independence had value that didn't require anyone else's validation or approval. As I prepared for bed in my own home, secure in my own choices, surrounded by the life I'd built through decades of love and careful decisions, I understood that some stories end not with reconciliation or forgiveness, but with justice and self-respect. And sometimes that's exactly the ending you need. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.